the village of St. Mary Mead was, on the whole, as ordinary as any village in the southern English countryside could hope to be. Its tidy cottages lined the narrow lanes, smoke curling gently from chimneys in the crisp autumn air. The villagers went about their lives with a comforting predictability, greeting one another on the high street with nods and pleasantries, discussing parish matters over cups of tea, and speculating endlessly on each other's private affairs, all under the ever-watchful eye of Miss Jane Marple. On a particularly golden afternoon, the tranquillity of St. Mary Mead was punctuated by a small but distinguished gathering at the rectory. Mrs. Caroline Abernethy, the rector's wife, had invited a selection of the village's notables to celebrate the harvest with tea and a modest display of her garden's late-blooming dahlias. The air was fragrant with autumn leaves and the faintly sweet aroma of freshly baked scones. Miss Marple, wearing her customary soft grey dress and lace collar, had been quietly observing the preparations from the rectory's side porch. She had a small notebook tucked into her handbag, though she wrote nothing. She preferred to commit details to memory. Her sharp eyes noted the subtle tensions, the way young Mr. Philip Winslow adjusted his tie with unnecessary frequency, or the way Mrs. Abernethy's sister, Miss Edith, lingered near the cake stand, her eyes darting toward the windows as if to ensure no one could observe her too closely. By 3 o'clock, the guests had assembled. Mr. Harold Clifton, the village solicitor, engaged in polite conversation with Mrs. Abernethy, while Miss Emily Price, a school teacher, fluttered nervously around the tea table. As Miss Marple poured herself a cup, she listened unobtrusively to the gentle hum of conversation, noting each inflection and hesitation, each minor gesture that hinted at hidden unease beneath the genteel exterior. Then came the announcement that would shatter the placid afternoon, a shriek from the drawing-room. Guests turned in unison to see young Miss Price standing by the grand oak desk, her hands trembling as she pointed at the drawer that had been securely locked until that very moment. It's open," she stammered, and there's someone." The room fell silent. Mr. Clifton moved to the desk, carefully lifting a folded envelope from the drawer. Its seal was broken, revealing a single sheet of paper, but the words inscribed upon it were enough to make the guest's polite composure crumble. Miss Marple, however, remained still, her sharp gaze scanning the faces of those around her. Some paled, others reddened, and a few, most noticeably the rector himself, looked away as if the contents of the letter threatened to unearth a long-buried discomfort. From the corner of her eye, Miss Marple noticed the almost imperceptible tremor in Mr. Winslow's hand and the slight tightening of Mrs. Abernethy's lips. It was a familiar kind of anxiety, one that spoke of secrets carefully guarded and trust betrayed. Yet the letter itself remained a mystery, its significance hidden beneath layers of social etiquette and polite shock. Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting the room's agitation settle into her mind like a pattern emerging from a jumbled puzzle. She did not rush. One did not rush with human nature. In the stillness of that moment, she understood that what seemed a minor domestic disturbance might, in truth, conceal something far darker. And in St. Mary Mead, darkness, when it appeared, had a way of hiding in the most unexpected of places. The news of the letter spread through the rectory and out into the village with the speed of wildfire, carried on hushed whispers and urgent glances. By the evening, everyone seemed to know that something unsettling had occurred, though no one could quite agree on what. At the vicarage, Mrs. Abernethy tried to maintain calm, but her hands shook as she set out the tea tray once more, her mind flitting back to the letter's contents and what consequences it might bring. The guests who remained lingered in the drawing-room, exchanging careful conjectures. "Do you suppose it could be some dreadful news about the estate?" Mrs. Abernethy asked softly, her eyes flicking toward the oak desk. "I hardly think so," murmured Miss Edith, her voice tight with something close to fear. "It must be personal. Very personal." Mr. Harold Clifton, the solicitor, frowned as he adjusted his spectacles. Whatever it is, it was meant to be kept secret. Someone knew the drawer could be opened. That is clear enough. Miss Marple, seated in her usual corner by the window, sipped her tea slowly, letting the speculation wash over her. She did not need to speak to gather information. Every anxious gesture, every averted glance, every slight catch of breath spoke volumes. Mr. Winslow, who had been uncharacteristically silent, finally rose and moved toward the fire, fingers nervously tugging at his sleeve. The subtle tension in his shoulders and the way he avoided eye contact told her that he had some stake in the matter, though whether as culprit or merely implicated, she could not yet say. By the next morning, the village itself was alive with conjecture. At the post office, Miss Marple overheard Mrs. Todd, the baker's wife, chattering excitedly to anyone who would listen. "I tell you, it's scandalous. Who would have thought our quiet little village could hide such secrets, and in the rectory of all places?" At the same time, gossip ran through the tea shop, the tailor's shop, and even the church choir. Everyone had a theory. Some suspected that the letter contained evidence of a long-forgotten will. Others whispered of a clandestine romance. Yet no one noticed the peculiar manner in which certain villagers, a quiet glance here, a hurried change of subject there, reacted when the letter was mentioned. Miss Marple, strolling through the high street on her morning walk, observed all this with the practiced eye of someone who had watched human nature for decades. She noted the subtle shifts in posture, the fleeting expressions of guilt or anxiety, in the slight, almost imperceptible exchanges of knowing glances. One villager would speak loudly of the supposed contents, only to be interrupted or corrected by another who seemed almost relieved that the subject had been broached. By noon, the rectory had summoned the police, and Inspector Foley arrived with his usual brisk efficiency. He questioned the Abernethys, the solicitor, and Miss Edith, though his method was straightforward and unadorned, relying more on procedure than on the nuances of human behavior. Miss Marple watched quietly as he drew conclusions based on the apparent opportunity and motive, noting how easily some villagers acquiesced to his line of questioning and how others, like Mr. Winslow, fidgeted and hemmed, offering nothing unless pressed. Miss Marple made no comment, though inside her mind she began to weave the threads together. There was more to this letter than its words, more to the rectory than its outward calm. In St. Mary Mead, it was rarely the facts alone that told the story. It was the way people reacted to them, and reactions, she had learned long ago, never lied. By late afternoon, the first rumors of blame had begun to solidify, though Miss Marple remained silent, allowing the village to speak and reveal itself. She made careful notes in her head, the way Mrs. Abernethy avoided her husband's eyes, the small tremor in Miss Edith's hands when she was asked about the drawer, and the tight, almost imperceptible clenching of Mr. Winslow's jaw when the solicitor mentioned inheritance. Each reaction was a clue in itself, though the villagers did not see them as such. And in the quiet corners of the rectory, Miss Marple realized that the letter, for all its secrecy, had done more than shock the village. It had begun to unravel the carefully constructed facades each person maintained. Some, she noted, would fight to preserve theirs at any cost. Others would crumble, revealing truths long hidden. And in that knowledge, she sensed that the real mystery was only just beginning. The following morning brought a brisk wind that rattled the branches of the village elms and carried the scent of fallen leaves through St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, having risen early as usual, walked slowly along the lane that led past the rectory, her eyes scanning for the smallest irregularities. The village was outwardly calm, but she could sense the undercurrent of unease, like a ripple moving just beneath the surface of a still pond. At the rectory, the household was already stirring. Mrs. Abernethy had insisted upon preparing breakfast for the returning inspector, though her hands trembled slightly as she poured the tea. Miss Edith hovered nearby, attempting casual conversation, but faltering whenever the subject of the letter arose. Mr. Harold Clifton, the solicitor, had taken to pacing the sitting room, muttering softly to himself about legal matters, while Miss Price, the schoolteacher, remained pale and quiet, as if the morning light had revealed the consequences of the previous day's revelation more sharply than the darkness had. Inspector Foley had returned to the rectory after a morning of questioning at the village hall, his brow furrowed as he considered the statements he had collected. Miss Marple, seated in her customary corner by the window, listened attentively as he spoke aloud, trying to piece together the puzzle with a mixture of procedure and intuition. "It's puzzling," he said, tapping a notebook with his pen. The drawer was locked. Only a few people could have known the combination, yet someone opened it without forced entry. That narrows our list of suspects considerably. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, sipping her tea. "People often reveal more than they realize, Inspector," she murmured. "Sometimes it is not what they do, but what they fail to do, that tells the truth." Foley gave her a polite nod, but did not press her further. He was used to relying on tangible evidence, while Miss Marple's insights came from the subtler study of human behavior, something he neither understood fully nor appreciated, though he had learned to respect it. Throughout the morning, villagers began to arrive at the rectory under various pretexts, some curious, others concerned, all eager for scraps of information. Miss Marple observed each one with a patient, unhurried eye. Mr. Winslow appeared again, ostensibly to discuss parish matters, yet every movement betrayed an underlying anxiety. His gaze lingered too long on the desk, and his fingers drummed nervously against the polished wood. Miss Marple noted the tension in the line of his shoulders and the quick, nervous glances he cast toward the locked drawer. Meanwhile, Miss Edith's composure was beginning to crack. She moved about the room with forced casualness, commenting on trivial matters while avoiding direct answers to any question about the letter. Miss Marple, whose attention was rarely distracted, saw the way her lips pressed together when she thought no one was watching, and the subtle stiffness in her posture whenever Mr. Clifton approached. By midday, the first serious speculation began to emerge. Mrs. Abernethy, though outwardly calm, could not entirely mask her concern. "It seems impossible," she whispered to Miss Marple, "that anyone here would want to harm us, or the rector. Yet, the letter—" She trailed off, glancing toward the oak desk as if expecting the envelope to leap into her hands. Miss Marple offered only a gentle nod. The letter, she thought, was a key, but not in the way most of the villagers imagined. Its significance lay not merely in its words, but in the reactions it had provoked. Each subtle gesture, each hesitation, each fleeting expression was another piece of the puzzle. By afternoon, the inspector had compiled a tentative list of people with access to the rectory and knowledge of the drawer, but Miss Marple observed quietly, noting inconsistencies he had overlooked. She noticed the way Mr. Winslow's eyes shifted whenever another name was mentioned, the slight tightening of Miss Edith's hands when certain phrases were spoken, and the way Mrs. Abernethy's calm tone faltered when the solicitor discussed legal matters involving her late aunt's estate. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the rectory lawn, Miss Marple felt the first stirrings of a clearer pattern. There was more at play than a simple act of curiosity or mischief. The letter had touched something deeper, something that had been carefully concealed for years, and she sensed, with the quiet certainty that came from decades of observing human nature, that the unfolding events were only the beginning, and that someone in the room was more deeply involved than anyone yet suspected. Miss Marple rose from her chair, smoothing her dress, and moved toward the window to glance at the village beyond. There was a certain stillness in the streets, a fragile calm that masked the undercurrents of fear and anticipation. She allowed herself a small, knowing smile. In St. Mary Mead, secrets never remained buried for long, and those who believed themselves clever were often the first to be revealed. As the days passed, the letter became the quiet centerpiece of every conversation in St. Mary Mead, though few dared speak of it directly in front of those who might be implicated. Miss Marple, true to her custom, did not engage in idle speculation. She observed, listened, and let the village reveal itself through its small gestures. The tilt of a hat, the way someone's eyes lingered too long on a passing stranger, the sudden change in tone when a seemingly trivial topic was mentioned. It was during one such morning, while walking along the path that bordered the rectory gardens, that she first noticed the way Miss Edith lingered near the hedge, pausing to adjust her gloves, as if to distract herself from something pressing. Miss Marple approached quietly, greeting her with a warm nod. Miss Edith startled slightly, and in that moment Miss Marple caught a flicker of something almost imperceptible, a brief tightening of the jaw, and a quick glance toward the rectory window. "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "The air is crisp today, perfect for clearing one's mind." Miss Edith managed a polite reply, but her gaze drifted again to the rectory. Miss Marple made a mental note of the subtle unease. Nothing overt, nothing accusatory, yet enough to mark her as someone with a particular interest in the letter, whether through worry, guilt, or fear. By late morning, the inspector returned to the rectory. More insistent than before, questioning each person about their whereabouts during the brief period when the drawer had been unlocked. Miss Marple observed the proceedings quietly, noting the hesitations, the careful choice of words, the almost imperceptible flinches when certain phrases were spoken. Mr. Winslow fidgeted repeatedly with his handkerchief, while Miss Edith shifted uncomfortably whenever the discussion touched on the rector's late aunt and her estate. After the questioning concluded, Miss Marple excused herself for a short walk. She wandered through the village lanes, her mind piecing together fragments of behavior, of gestures, of conversations overheard in corners of the post office, the tea shop, and the school. Something about the pattern of reactions did not align with a simple case of curiosity or mischief. Returning to the rectory by mid-afternoon, she found the atmosphere subdued, almost stifled. Mrs. Abernethy sat quietly in the sitting room, dabbing at her eyes with a delicate handkerchief, while Miss Price attempted to tidy the tea table, her movements jerky and uncertain. Miss Marple's gaze fell once more on the oak desk. The letter still lay where it had been placed, its contents known to some, feared by others, yet entirely ignored by those who might have read it with indifference. It was then that Miss Marple noticed a small detail that had eluded everyone else. A single envelope, slightly crumpled, lay partially hidden beneath the desk blotter. The seal had been broken, but the paper within remained folded carefully. She bent slightly, noting the delicate handwriting that matched the rector's aunt's familiar script. Something about the placement of the envelope, the angle of its concealment, and the way it had apparently been ignored by all present struck her as unusual. Her mind began to connect threads, the anxious glances, the subtle gestures of avoidance, the conversations that skirted the edges of truth. The letter and the envelope together formed a puzzle, each piece reflecting not only hidden motives but also the careful orchestration of appearances. By evening, as the village settled into its quiet routine, Miss Marple sat in her favorite chair by the window, quietly reflecting on the day's observations. She understood that the superficial panic and gossip were only distractions from the underlying truth. Beneath the veneer of genteel composure, she sensed a tangle of resentments, long-buried rivalries, and carefully guarded secrets. Someone in St. Mary Mead had acted deliberately, and it was not chance that had revealed the letter. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, knowing smile. The day's subtle clues had not yet yielded answers, but they had revealed something far more valuable, the behavior of the villagers themselves. And in the quiet logic of human nature, she knew, lay the key to uncovering the mystery. The following morning brought a chill that hinted at the coming winter, and Miss Marple, as was her custom, took her usual stroll through the village, noting the small signs of unease that lingered from the rectory incident. At the post office, she overheard snippets of conversation that though outwardly casual, betrayed an undercurrent of suspicion. "I can't believe anyone here would be capable of such deceit," one woman whispered. And yet, the trailing hesitation said more than any accusation. By mid-morning, Miss Marple returned to the rectory under the pretext of visiting Mrs. Abernethy for a cup of tea. The household was subdued, and the oak desk, the source of so much curiosity, sat quietly in the drawing-room. Miss Marple's eyes, however, did not rest on the letter itself. She had already noted the envelope beneath the blotter, and now her attention shifted to an even smaller, seemingly insignificant detail: a faint smudge of ink on the edge of the desk drawer, as though someone had hastily wiped a finger after writing or handling a document. It was minor enough to be overlooked, yet it spoke of nervous haste, of a hurried hand that had feared discovery. The villagers' reactions that day offered further insight. Mr. Winslow had taken to lingering in the hallway, ostensibly to check on the arrangements for a parish meeting, yet every movement betrayed an anxious tension. Miss Edith appeared restless, often retreating to the window to stare absent-mindedly at the garden, as if seeking escape in the familiar scenery. Even the rector, usually composed, showed brief moments of distraction, pauses in conversation where his eyes darted toward the desk or toward someone who might be observing him. Miss Marple, quietly taking her place in the sitting-room, observed each subtle gesture. She noted the way people avoided mentioning the letter directly, how some changed the subject abruptly, and how others, like Miss Price, seemed almost relieved when conversation turned to unrelated matters. Each hesitation, each flicker of expression, offered a clue about who was genuinely troubled by the letter, and who was merely performing an outward show of concern. By afternoon, the solicitor, Mr. Clifton, returned with additional questions regarding the estate and the late aunt's affairs. He spoke with a mixture of courtesy and caution, aware that tensions were high. Yet even he seemed unaware of the undercurrents Miss Marple had discerned. The nervous fidgeting of Mr. Winslow, the subtle avoidance by Miss Edith, and the brief shadow of apprehension that crossed Mrs. Abernethy's face whenever legal matters were mentioned. Miss Marple allowed the others to speak, to reveal themselves through their words and actions, while she quietly pieced together the hidden patterns. She noticed that the envelope beneath the blotter had not been disturbed again, suggesting that whoever had handled it was confident no one else would take note. And she understood, with a quiet certainty, that the small details, easily dismissed by others, were in fact the strongest evidence of all. As evening fell and the rectory settled into a muted calm, Miss Marple reflected on the day's observations. She recognized that the letter, while important, was merely a catalyst. The true story lay in human behavior, in the nervous hands, the averted eyes, the carefully measured words, and the subtle, almost imperceptible reactions to one another. And she knew that, before long, these reactions would reveal something far more significant than the letter itself, a hidden truth, long obscured, that could change the lives of everyone in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile, her mind quietly arranging the pieces. Patience, she reminded herself, was essential. The real insight, as always, would emerge not from haste, but from careful observation and from the way people revealed themselves when they thought no one was truly watching. The following morning was grey and damp, a persistent drizzle coating the village in a silvery mist. Miss Marple moved along the lanes with her usual deliberate pace, noting how the wet leaves made the familiar paths seem unfamiliar and slightly treacherous, as if the village itself had grown cautious. Even in such weather, St. Mary Mead was alive with subdued curiosity. From behind curtained windows and half-open doors, villagers cast brief glances at one another, careful to appear ordinary, yet the air carried the tension that had settled after the letter's revelation. By mid-morning, Miss Marple found herself again at the rectory, ostensibly for another cup of tea with Mrs. Abernethy. The household was quieter than usual, and the desk, though still displaying the letter and its accompanying envelope, seemed almost to watch the occupants as they moved about. Miss Marple's gaze, however, remained focused on human behavior rather than the objects themselves. She noticed the subtle stiffness in Miss Edith's walk, the way her fingers lingered along the edge of the desk as if recalling some memory she wished to conceal. Mr. Winslow, on the other hand, had adopted a different strategy. He lingered near the doorway, leaning against the frame, eyes darting back and forth, measuring reactions as though everyone in the room were a piece on a chessboard. Miss Marple quietly observed the interactions over breakfast. Mrs. Abernethy, usually precise in her manners, now hesitated before serving tea, her mind seemingly divided between decorum and worry. Miss Price, still pale and anxious, offered only curt responses to questions, avoiding direct eye contact with anyone except the rector. Even the inspector, who had returned to the rectory for further inquiries, failed to notice the delicate dance of gestures, the small tells that revealed far more than words ever could. By midday, a new development drew attention: a brief scuffle outside the rectory garden. Miss Marple stepped to the window just in time to see a figure, her eyes immediately recognizing Miss Edith, hurrying along the path, glancing furtively over her shoulder. Moments later, a small package had been discreetly delivered to the rectory by the postman, and the curiosity it sparked was almost immediate. Miss Marple noted the timing. The package had arrived just as Miss Edith had returned from her mysterious errand, and its presence seemed to heighten the tension in the room. As the solicitor, Mr. Clifton, carefully examined the parcel, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Miss Edith, whose composure wavered ever so slightly. The subtle signs, the brief tightening of the lips, the way she clenched her hands momentarily before relaxing, spoke volumes to someone who knew how to read human nature. It was not the package itself that mattered, Miss Marple realized, but the reaction it provoked. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself alone with the rector in the drawing room. She spoke quietly, letting the conversation drift over familiar topics while gently steering it toward observations she had made. "It is curious," she said, "how small gestures often reveal more than words. A hand trembles, a glance lingers, and suddenly one sees the story behind appearances." The rector nodded absently, more concerned with the outward calm of his household than the subtleties Miss Marple described. Yet she knew he had heard her carefully chosen words. By evening, the mood in the rectory had shifted once again. Miss Edith, restless and pale, excused herself early, claiming a headache, while Mr. Winslow lingered longer than necessary, ostensibly to discuss parish matters, though the subtle anxiety in his movements betrayed other concerns. Miss Marple, seated quietly by the window, sipped her tea and allowed the patterns to settle in her mind. She understood, with the clarity that came from years of observing human behavior, that the villagers' reactions, what they revealed unintentionally, were far more telling than any physical evidence. The letter, the envelope, even the package, were merely triggers. The real story was encoded in gestures, expressions, and the small, almost imperceptible ways in which people betrayed their true thoughts. And Miss Marple knew, as she had always known, that if one watched carefully enough, the truth would reveal itself, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet subtleties of human nature. The next morning, the village awoke to a thin frost that sparkled across the lawns and the narrow cobbled streets, lending an almost crystalline sharpness to the usual quiet of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, wrapped in her usual grey coat and shawl, walked with measured steps along the lane toward the rectory. Her mind, as ever, was preoccupied with the patterns she had begun to see, the subtle, almost imperceptible behaviors that had spoken more plainly than any spoken accusation. By the time she reached the rectory, a fresh tension had taken hold. News had spread that the solicitor had uncovered an unexpected clause in the late aunt's will, a clause that could significantly alter the distribution of the estate. The villagers, who had already been uneasy, now approached with a heightened curiosity, their eyes bright with speculation and, in some cases, thinly veiled anticipation. Inside, Miss Edith moved about with a restless energy, attending to the smallest household details with meticulous care, yet her hands trembled slightly, betraying an inner unease. Mr. Winslow lingered near the drawing-room door, ostensibly to discuss parish matters, but his eyes continually flicked toward the desk. Even the rector, generally calm and measured, displayed a tension in his posture that Miss Marple did not fail to notice. The solicitor, Mr. Clifton, had brought papers for the rector to examine. As he spoke of the will and its unexpected conditions, he was careful to maintain a professional detachment, yet he could not conceal the quick, almost imperceptible glance he cast at Miss Edith when he mentioned the new clause. It was a small signal, easily overlooked, but Miss Marple observed it with quiet interest. The web of reactions was growing ever more intricate, and she could see the subtle interplay of fear, hope, and guarded calculation. Miss Price, sitting quietly at the side of the room, seemed to shrink into herself as the discussion progressed, her eyes darting between the others as if attempting to measure their reactions against her own understanding of what had occurred. She said little, but each word, each pause, carried weight. Miss Marple noted the small hesitations, the careful phrasing of questions and replies, all signs that the letter's content and the new clause in the will were linked to deeper, more personal concerns than the casual observer might realize. By mid-afternoon, an unexpected development unsettled the room further. A visitor arrived, Mrs. Clara Middleton, a distant cousin who had rarely been seen in the village but had evidently taken an interest in the estate. She was brisk, precise in manner, and immediately set about questioning the solicitor with pointed inquiries. Her presence, while formally polite, caused a ripple of tension. Miss Edith flinched slightly. Mr. Winslow's posture stiffened, and even the rector's usual calm gave way to a fleeting uncertainty. Miss Marple, quietly seated near the window, watched each gesture with keen interest, noting how the arrival of an outsider altered the balance of unease. It became evident to Miss Marple that the revelation of the will's clause had stirred long-hidden ambitions and resentment. The subtle changes in posture, the brief flashes of annoyance or anxiety, the carefully controlled expressions, all were small signals of larger truths buried beneath the polite veneer of village life. And she understood that while the solicitor, the rector, and the inspector focused on the legal and procedural aspects, the real clues lay in the psychology of those present. As evening approached, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet reflection. The events of the day had revealed more than any formal investigation could. The true stakes, the fears, and the motives of those surrounding the letter were becoming clearer. In St. Mary Mead, appearances were always deceptive, and the quietest, smallest gestures often held the weight of secrets long kept. She smiled faintly to herself, for she knew the stage was set, and the next twist in the story would bring those hidden truths into sharper relief, testing the villagers in ways they could not yet imagine. The following morning brought a brittle sunlight that cast long shadows across the rectory lawn, and with it came an air of expectation that seemed to weigh upon St. Mary Mead more heavily than the frost. Miss Marple, taking her usual walk along the garden path, noticed how the dew glistened like scattered diamonds on the hedges, yet her attention was drawn less to the beauty of the day than to the subtle signs of agitation among the household staff. There was a stiffness in their movements, a cautiousness in their glances, as if they too sensed that the quiet order of the rectory was on the verge of being disrupted again. Inside, the rectory was unusually quiet. The rector, normally the first to greet visitors with warmth, seemed preoccupied, his eyes repeatedly straying toward the desk where the letter and envelope rested. Miss Edith, though outwardly composed, betrayed her anxiety in small, almost imperceptible ways, tapping a foot beneath the table, smoothing her gloves repeatedly, and frequently checking her watch. Mr. Winslow, who had been lingering longer than propriety demanded, now paced near the window, his gaze flickering toward the approaching road, as though expecting someone or something. It was then that the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the hallway. Miss Marple, already alert, noted how every occupant of the room instinctively shifted in posture, their eyes momentarily betraying curiosity, concern, or dread. The visitor was Mrs. Clarissa Middleton, returned unexpectedly, her expression a careful blend of courtesy and determination. In her hand, she carried a small parcel, sealed and wrapped with meticulous care, which she handed to the rector without explanation. The solicitor, Mr. Clifton, rose immediately, glancing at the parcel with professional interest, yet it was the reactions of those present that drew Miss Marple's keen eye. Miss Edith flinched slightly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. Mr. Winslow's jaw stiffened, and even the rector's calm demeanor flickered for a moment as he accepted the package. Miss Marple understood at once that the contents of this parcel, like the letter before it, had the potential to unravel more than the household's composure. It threatened to expose intentions, fears, and perhaps even guilt that had long remained buried. The afternoon unfolded with a careful, tense rhythm. Mr. Clifton examined the parcel with meticulous attention, speaking in measured tones about formalities, while Mrs. Middleton watched everyone in turn, noting each small reaction. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the window, absorbed every detail. The flicker of worry in Mrs. Abernethy's eyes, the barely perceptible stiffening of Miss Edith's posture, and the almost imperceptible tightening of Mr. Winslow's hands. Each gesture was a small, deliberate signal, revealing more than words ever could. It was during a brief lull in conversation that Miss Marple noticed a subtle yet crucial clue. The envelope within the parcel, though carefully wrapped, bore the faint smudge of ink along one corner. It was slight, easily overlooked by anyone not accustomed to observing the minutiae of human activity, but it spoke volumes to Miss Marple. Someone had handled it hastily, perhaps even nervously, and then tried to conceal their actions. The question, as always, was who and why. As evening fell, the rectory settled into a tense calm. The visitors had departed, but the air remained charged with quiet apprehension. Miss Marple, knitting calmly by the fireside, reflected on the day's events. Each reaction, each gesture, each careful avoidance had been another thread in the intricate web surrounding the letter, the will, and the parcel. She understood, with the steady certainty that had guided her for decades, that these small human details would ultimately reveal the truth far more convincingly than any document, any rumor, or any overt display of evidence. And in that stillness, Miss Marple realized that the true test lay ahead, to observe the final reactions when the hidden connections were drawn together, and to discern which of those present had acted not out of coincidence or carelessness, but with deliberate intent. The stage was set, the players in motion, and the resolution, when it came, would hinge entirely upon the truth revealed through the quiet, unguarded moments of human behavior. The next morning arrived with a muted grey sky that pressed low over the village, and the usual bustle of St. Mary Mead seemed subdued, as if the very air held its breath. Miss Marple, walking along the familiar path that cut through the rectory garden, noted the frost-tipped leaves clinging stubbornly to the hedges. She paused to observe a small bird flitting nervously between branches, and in its sudden, darting movements, she saw a reflection of the tension that had taken hold within the rectory walls. Inside, the household was unusually silent. Mrs. Abernethy moved with a careful precision, attending to minor domestic details, yet her eyes betrayed a subtle unease whenever she glanced at the desk. Miss Edith lingered near the window, hands clasped tightly together, shifting her gaze repeatedly to the doorway as if expecting someone or fearing a rival. Mr. Winslow, who had been staying longer than necessary, under the pretext of parish matters, paced lightly, his eyes sharp and attentive, yet betraying an underlying anxiety that Miss Marple noted with careful interest. By late morning, an unexpected message arrived from the solicitor, Mr. Clifton, requesting an urgent meeting at the rectory. It concerned a further revelation in the aunt's estate documents, a minor codicil that, though seemingly trivial, carried implications for the entire distribution of the inheritance. The rectory's atmosphere tightened noticeably as the household prepared to receive him. Miss Marple, sitting quietly with a cup of tea, observed the almost imperceptible signs of anticipation. A slight quickening of breath here, a tightening of the lips there, and the careful, controlled movements that betrayed internal calculation. When Mr. Clifton arrived, he spoke in measured tones, outlining the codicil's existence and its potential consequences. Each villager reacted differently, yet all revealed something through small gestures. Miss Edith, who had seemed composed, shifted in her chair and clutched the arms tightly, a brief flicker of worry crossing her face. Mr. Winslow straightened abruptly, as if bracing himself for news he did not wish to hear, while Mrs. Abernethy's calm composure faltered for just a heartbeat, her gaze dropping toward the desk as if seeking reassurance from the familiar object. Miss Marple listened without comment, her eyes quietly tracing each movement, each expression, each micro-reaction that the others believed went unnoticed. She noted the way certain names mentioned by the solicitor caused subtle reactions, slight flinches, hurried glances, and a carefully masked tightening of the jaw. These were the clues the inspector had overlooked, the undercurrents of fear, desire, and long-held resentment that the documents alone could never reveal. By mid-afternoon, a new twist arose. Miss Price, who had been a silent observer until then, appeared suddenly at the rectory door with a small note clutched in her hand. Her hands shook faintly, and she avoided looking directly at anyone as she handed it to the rector. The contents of the note were brief, yet enough to introduce a fresh tension. Someone outside the immediate household had been watching, and they had something important to convey. The reactions were telling. Miss Edith's lips pressed together tightly. Mr. Winslow's hand trembled slightly as he took the note from the rector, and even Mrs. Abernethy's eyes flickered with unease. Miss Marple, ever quiet, observed these signs closely. The letter, the envelope, the codicil, and now this note, all were pieces of a complex puzzle. But it was not merely the documents themselves that mattered. It was the way people responded to them, the subtle admissions in gestures and glances that revealed more than words could express. As evening fell, the rectory settled into a tense, expectant calm. Miss Marple sat in her chair by the window, knitting idly, though her mind worked steadily. She understood, with her usual clarity, that the forthcoming moments, interactions, reactions, perhaps even mistakes, would illuminate the truth more fully than any inquiry or interrogation. In St. Mary Mead, appearances were seldom what they seemed, and the real revelations often lay hidden in the quiet, unnoticed movements of those who believed themselves unseen. She allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The time was approaching when the hidden truths would begin to surface, and she would be ready to watch, to observe, and to understand. The next day dawned with a pale light filtering through a mist that hung stubbornly over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, taking her customary early walk, noted how the village seemed unusually still. The usual chatter muted as if everyone had sensed the tension that had settled over the rectory like an invisible weight. She paused to observe a neighbor's cat slinking along the fence, its careful, measured movements reflecting the caution she saw in the villagers themselves. By mid-morning, the rectory was already alive with quiet activity. Mrs. Abernethy moved briskly about, attending to the trivialities of domestic order, yet her eyes frequently strayed to the oak desk, betraying the concern that lay beneath her careful manners. Miss Edith lingered near the window, hands folded tightly, glancing repeatedly at the doorway as if expecting someone or dreading an encounter she could not control. Mr. Winslow, for his part, lingered near the hearth, eyes flicking continually toward the desk and the envelope still concealed beneath the blotter. Even the rector seemed slightly unsteady, as if the previous day's revelations had unsettled the very foundation of his calm. The solicitor arrived once more, bringing with him additional correspondence relating to the late aunt's estate. Miss Marple observed the reactions carefully. Miss Edith's eyes widened slightly, and she pressed her hands together as if to restrain an impulse. Mr. Winslow's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Mrs. Abernethy's polite composure trembled ever so subtly. Even the words spoken by the solicitor carried weight, carefully chosen and measured, yet Miss Marple could see the impact on each listener. It was in the quiet of the afternoon that the subtle pattern Miss Marple had been tracing for days became clearer. She watched as Miss Edith, under the pretext of fetching tea, lingered by the desk, her fingers brushing against the envelope beneath the blotter. The brief hesitation, the almost imperceptible tightening of her grip, and the nervous glance she cast toward Mr. Winslow all confirmed what Miss Marple had long suspected. The envelope, the letter, and the documents were more than just legal curiosities. They were keys to hidden motives, carefully guarded secrets, and fears that had festered beneath polite appearances. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. She knew that the final test of truth was approaching. Human nature, in its subtle gestures, in its small, almost unconscious reactions, would ultimately betray the guilty party. And as she watched, she realized that the web of tension, carefully maintained by social etiquette and suppressed emotion, was beginning to unravel, revealing the hidden fractures that lay beneath the surface. By evening, the rectory had grown quieter, though the air remained charged with anticipation. The solicitor and the rector retired to their papers. Miss Edith sat silently by the window, and Mr. Winslow lingered near the doorway, watching everyone else as much as being watched. Miss Marple, seated calmly with her knitting, observed them all with the patient, incisive gaze of one who understood the intricate patterns of human behavior. She knew that the final revelation would hinge not on a dramatic confrontation, but on the smallest of human details, a twitch of an eyelid, a hesitant word, a hand that lingered too long on an object. And she knew, as she had always known, that when the moment came, everything, the letter, the envelope, the documents, the subtle gestures, the whispered fears, would fall into place. The real story, long hidden beneath a carefully maintained veneer of propriety, was ready to emerge, and Miss Marple would be there to witness it, quietly and completely prepared. The following morning arrived crisp and clear, the frost glinting in the early sunlight, giving the rectory garden a delicate sparkle. Miss Marple, wrapped in her shawl, moved slowly along the path, observing the village with her usual attentive eye. The usual bustle seemed diminished. Even the children walking to school appeared subdued, as if sensing the weight of events that had quietly taken hold over the past days. By mid-morning, the rectory was again the center of subdued activity. The solicitor, Mr. Clifton, had arrived early with additional papers relating to the aunt's estate. He moved with careful precision, placing each document on the desk as though handling delicate glass. Miss Edith hovered nearby, her composure strained, hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles were white. Mr. Winslow lingered near the window, his movements taut, eyes shifting constantly from the desk to the other occupants. Even Mrs. Abernethy, ever gracious, seemed preoccupied, offering polite words that carried a faint tremor of unease. Miss Marple, seated quietly in her usual corner, observed the subtle cues that would escape anyone unaccustomed to reading human behavior. She noted how Miss Edith's eyes followed every motion of Mr. Clifton's hands, how Mr. Winslow's posture stiffened when certain names were mentioned, and how Mrs. Abernethy's polite smiles faltered for the briefest instant when the solicitor referenced the late aunt's codicils. Each detail was a clue, small yet telling, revealing the unspoken concerns and hidden intentions that the documents themselves merely hinted at. As the solicitor prepared to leave, Miss Marple seized the opportunity to engage subtly with Miss Edith. "You seem particularly interested in the contents of these papers," she remarked gently, her voice carrying no accusation, only mild curiosity. Miss Edith's hands froze for a moment on the edge of the desk, and a faint blush colored her cheeks. Her eyes flicked to the envelope beneath the blotter, a hesitation so fleeting that only someone watching closely would notice. Miss Marple allowed a small, knowing smile. The reaction, minor though it seemed, confirmed much of what she had long suspected. Later that afternoon, as the rectory settled into a quiet stillness, Mr. Winslow approached Miss Marple under the pretext of discussing parish matters. His movements were careful, measured, yet the subtle tremor in his hand betrayed a tension he attempted to conceal. Miss Marple listened quietly, allowing him to speak, observing each gesture, each shift of expression, as though he were revealing his thoughts without intending to. The pattern had become clear. Both Miss Edith and Mr. Winslow were intimately connected to the circumstances surrounding the letter and the envelope, and both had reacted in ways that suggested careful concealment rather than mere anxiety. By evening, the household had quieted, though an underlying tension remained. Miss Marple, knitting calmly by the window, reflected on the threads she had observed over the past days. The anxious gestures, the subtle avoidance, the fleeting expressions of guilt and fear. She understood that the moment to test the true nature of the reactions was approaching. The real revelation would not come from words alone, but from the quiet, instinctive truths that human behavior could not disguise. And she knew that when the time arrived, every small detail, the letter, the envelope, the codicils, the gestures, the glances, would converge to expose the heart of the mystery. With a faint, contented smile, Miss Marple set her knitting aside. She would wait, watch, and allow human nature to speak as it always did, revealing secrets that had been long hidden beneath the veneer of propriety and decorum. The resolution was near, and she was ready. Evening settled over St. Mary Mead with a quiet, almost reverent hush, the sort that seemed to signal the approach of a moment long anticipated. Within the rectory, the household moved with careful restraint. The usual comfort of domestic routine was replaced by a taut stillness, as if every footstep and rustle of paper carried more weight than it should. Miss Marple, knitting by the window, observed all with the serenity of someone who had long ago learned that in such moments, patience was as potent as insight. As the hour grew later, Miss Edith approached the desk, her movements cautious, fingers brushing against the envelope beneath the blotter. Her eyes darted toward Mr. Winslow, who stood near the doorway, his posture taut and hands lightly clenched. The rector, oblivious to the tension he could not see, moved quietly about, placing a few papers back in their folders, unaware of the subtle drama unfolding under his roof. Miss Marple rose, her movement deliberate but unassuming, and approached the two with a gentle, almost conversational tone. "It seems to me," she said softly, "that certain matters, once revealed, have a way of making their own significance known, even when we try to ignore them." She glanced at the envelope, and then back to Miss Edith and Mr. Winslow, allowing a moment for her words to settle. A faint, almost imperceptible tightening of Miss Edith's hands betrayed the effect. Mr. Winslow's eyes flickered, and he shifted slightly, unable to conceal the tension that Miss Marple had been observing for days. The old detective's gaze, patient and unhurried, traced their reactions carefully. She had already noted every hesitation, every small gesture, and now the moment had come to allow them to reveal themselves through the truth of their own responses. Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but firm. "The letter, the envelope, and all these codicils. None of them are accidental, and yet it is not the papers themselves that hold the answer, but the choices people make when confronted with them. Her eyes met Miss Edith's for a long moment, then shifted toward Mr. Winslow. Both, though striving to maintain composure, could not entirely conceal the flicker of recognition in their expressions. Slowly, deliberately, Miss Marple stepped closer to the desk and lifted the envelope, revealing its contents with the care of someone handling something precious. She spread the papers before them, noting how the eyes of both Miss Edith and Mr. Winslow followed every movement. "It is curious," she said softly, "how secrecy, when forced into the open, can reveal far more than even the most careful concealment. And so, we see not only what is written here, but what the actions and reactions of those involved have been telling us all along." A long silence filled the room, broken only by the quiet rustle of paper. Miss Edith's composure faltered first, her hands falling to her lap as she let out a small, restrained sigh. Mr. Winslow, too, finally relaxed his tense posture, though the tightness around his eyes betrayed lingering apprehension. Miss Marple, seated once more, allowed a quiet smile. "The truth," she said, almost conversationally, "was never hidden in the papers alone. It lay in the gestures, the hesitations, the carefully measured words, and, most importantly, in the human nature that none of us can entirely disguise. The letter revealed intentions, the envelope revealed opportunity, and the codicils revealed stakes, but the story itself has always been told by you." Miss Edith looked down, a faint blush coloring her cheeks, while Mr. Winslow exhaled a breath he had evidently been holding for days. The tension in the rectory dissolved slowly, replaced by the quiet understanding that Miss Marple's patient observation had, as always, uncovered the truth with subtlety and precision. And as the last light of evening filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow across the desk and the scattered papers, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the window. She resumed her knitting, her gaze distant yet content, quietly reflecting that in St. Mary Mead, human nature always spoke its secrets, one small gesture at a time, and that careful observation, patience, and understanding were all that was required to see them revealed. The mystery of the secret letter, the hidden envelope, and the codicils had come to its quiet, inevitable conclusion, leaving the rectory and the village to settle once more into a semblance of peace, though with a renewed awareness that even the most seemingly ordinary of lives could harbor hidden depths and unspoken truths.